The Georgia Railroad and Banking Company, also seen as GARR, was a historic railroad and banking company that operated in the U.S. state of Georgia. In 1967 it reported 833 million revenue ton-miles of freight and 3 million passenger miles. At the end of the year it operated 331 miles of road and 510 miles of track. History. The company was chartered in 1833 in Augusta, Georgia. In 1835, the charter was amended to include banking. Originally the line was chartered to build a railroad from Augusta to Athens, with a branch to Madison. The 5-feet gauge railroad opened in 1845 with J. Edgar Thompson as its chief engineer and Richard Peters as its first superintendent. At the time the rates were as follows: 5 per mile for passengers, 50 per 100 miles for freight. Several other railroads were then under construction. The Western and Atlantic Railroad was chartered to build a line from 7 miles south of the Chattahoochee River at a point named Terminus, to Chattanooga, Tennessee. The South Carolina Railroad was building a line from Charleston to North Augusta, South Carolina. The Memphis and Charleston Railroad was being built from Memphis to Chattanooga. The Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad and the Louisville and Nashville Railroad were both constructing rival lines between Louisville, Kentucky, and Nashville, Tennessee. The Georgia Railroad decided to extend the Madison branch to Terminus and thereby compete with the Central Railroad and Banking Company of Georgia, which together with the Macon 7 Western Railroad was competing for traffic through Charleston's rival port of Savannah, Georgia. By 1850, this railroad had built 213 miles of track and was up to 232 miles by 1860. At the time, goods from the Mississippi and Ohio valleys had to go by riverboat to New Orleans and then via coastal steamships around the Florida Keys to get to the big population centers in the Northeast. Shipping cross-country by rail to the ports of Charleston and Savannah made perfect economic sense. The banking side of the business was quickly more successful than the railroad side. The Georgia Railroad and Banking Company was perhaps the strongest bank in Georgia for many years. The bankers used some of the wealth to buy controlling interests in the Atlanta and West Point Railroad and the Western Railway of Alabama, which provided a continuous line from Atlanta to Montgomery, Alabama, although the WOFA was standard gauge, while all the other lines in the South were broad gauge. Civil War. During the American Civil War, the Confederate States of America maintained a gunpowder factory in Augusta. Carloads of gunpowder would be transported on the Georgia Railroad to various battlefields in the Western Campaign. Although the Civil War saw heavy damage to railroads such as the Georgia Railroad, management used the considerable resources to restore operation as quickly as possible. The Georgia Railroad even resorted to temporarily abandoning the Athens branch to secure enough rail to reopen its main line. Returning Confederate soldiers were given free rides home, to the extent that the company's limited rail network would allow. They also honored all Confederate scrip issued by the bank. No depositor lost the savings even if Confederate money had no value. It helped that the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company had the financial strength to honor those promises. At the time, most Southern banks were repudiating any obligations related to Confederate currency. This helped to solidify the bank's reputation as one of the premier banks in the southeastern United States, well into the 20th century. Post-war years. The Georgia Railroad Freight Depot, designed by architect Max Corput, was completed in 1869 and is the oldest building in downtown Atlanta. The company was later rechartered as the Georgia Railroad Bank, then a subsidiary of the First Railroad and Banking Company, which eventually opened banks in Atlanta under the name of First Georgia Bank. The banking operations were merged with First Union in 1986, and First Union subsequently merged with Wachovia Corporation. The Georgia Railroad Bank entered the insurance business using subsidiaries such as First of Georgia. However, these were subsequently sold at considerable profit to the company. In 1881, Colonel William M. Wadley, Central Railroad and Banking Company of Georgia president, leased the railroad properties of the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company, including the A&AMP, WP and WOFA. Wadley assigned half of the lease to his company and half to the L&AMP-N. Following the Panic of 1896, the Central went into receivership and its portion of the lease lapsed, whereupon it was eventually reassigned to the Atlantic Coast Line Railroad. In 1902, the ACL acquired controlling interest in the L&AMP-N. Thus the Georgia A&AMP, WP, and WOFA became non-operating subsidiaries of the Atlantic Coast Line. With the building of the Savannah and Atlanta Railroad, which connected with the Georgia Railroad at Warrenton, the Georgia Railroad now competed with the Central of Georgia Railroad for traffic to and from Savannah. Soon the ACL came to dominate the Augusta interchange traffic, through its Charleston and Western Carolina Railway subsidiary and via the ACL's spur from its main line at Florence, South Carolina, in order that the Georgia Railroad could compete with the Seaboard Airline Railroad and Southern Railway for traffic from Atlanta up the eastern seaboard. A unique feature of the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company charter was that the state legislature gave the corporation large tax breaks, which were legally challenged on several occasions. The charter also called for daily except Sunday passenger service. The lawyers advised management to maintain passenger service on all lines, so as to not violate the charter. The Georgia was perhaps the last railroad to operate both freight and passenger trains in the lower 48 states into the Amtrak era. CSX. The Georgia Railroad originally fell under common management with the Atlanta and AMP, West Point Railroad and the Western Railway of Alabama, commonly known as the West Point Route. In 1967, ACL merged with the Seaboard Airline Railroad to form the Seaboard Coast Line Railroad. In the early 1970s, SCL merged with the Louisville and AMP Nashville Railroad and the Clinchfield Railroad to become the Family Lines system. Family Lines continued to operate the Georgia Railroad under its initial charter. The Georgia Railroad was maintained as a separate company, with Family Lines leasing the rail properties. 1983 saw the end of the Georgia Railroad as a separate company, after Family Lines purchased the railroad properties of the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company, which had until then been the subject of lease. In 1986, SCL merged with the chassis system to form CSX Transportation. The same year, Georgia Railroad Bank was acquired by First Union. 1867 Rail timetable. Distances of depots from Atlanta. Trains departed from Atlanta at 8:55 a.m. and 7:15 p.m. and arrived in Augusta at 6 p.m. and 10:05 a.m.